those are all physiological responses to a negative stress. And so, of course, if that is physical, what happens after is also physical for our bodies with trauma. And so understanding that movement is then a physical modality to meet a physical experience or happening in our body, that feels like it makes so much sense once we actually kind of make that connection of that trauma itself was also physical. Yes, of course, psychological, but physical.
Okay, Wellness Ninjas, welcome back to another episode of the Wellness Dojo Podcast. I'm your host, Craik, and excited to have our guest here today, as always. Our guest today is an instructor and clinical coordinator at the University of Utah, who's passionate about the relationship between movement and psychology. This is something that's so important, so I'm excited to dive in. Welcome to the show, O Farrell.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here, and I'm excited to dive in and pick your brain a little bit about this because, in my opinion, I think this is an area that's very overlooked. With we do talk about it a lot, and we do see it. We are seeing it pop up more and more, but that relationship between movement and psychology, just so important. So
Yeah.
excited to hear from you, and maybe if you can start by just telling the audience a little bit about how you got to this type of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, if we go way back, I think that I've always kind of identified as a mover of sorts, right? And I think that's really where this all started for me was I've always loved moving for lots of different reasons. So when I was very young, it was team sports, volleyball, basketball, those sorts of things, and then just like getting out in nature, hiking. I actually grew up in southern Alberta, and so just being able to like move in spaces that I love in national parks, things like that has always been so fun to me. And I not only did I feel confident and kind of joy in those spaces, but I also realized that I was seeing that in other people, and that was very intriguing to me. And so I kind of pursued my education with that love in mind. And then I was bouncing back and forth between all sorts of different paths within medicine and health. And I kind of randomly, got a second degree during my bachelor's in French. And as part of that degree, I had to go to on an internship. And so I ended up getting the opportunity to go to Paris and work with folks that were navigating really hard life circumstances. And when they described my job to me, they said, "Your job is to make people happy." And I was like, okay, I can do this. Let's see how we actually navigate that. And there were lots of strategies that we used. But one of the main strategies that I actually used, and I think I was leaning on my love of movement from the past, was moving with other people. And so we'd go on walks in the park. We'd find ways to gather and move together, whether it was just like really gentle movement or exercising together. And that started to confirm for me that first, health is so complex and beautiful and kind of messy. And I was more interested personally in navigating movement for preventive care, but also just like overall well-being and thriving as opposed to lack of disease. I realized that I was interested in kind of that broader definition of what health is. So then I came to my master's degree looking at health coaching and exercise physiology as kind of my emphasis, and really thinking about health behavior changes, which your group, that's a lot of the conversations that you're having with folks as well. And during that kind of phase of my life, I was able to work with a group of women mostly that were survivors of torture and had come to the United States with refugee status. And so I worked with them. And again, we did lots of we cooked together, we talked together, all of those things. But those really kind of poignant moments for me of change and joy and stepping away from the symptomology of trauma was moving. And so then from there, I kind of dived in and really dedicated my research to that and understanding how movement helps individuals psychologically thrive.
Yeah. Wow. So cool to hear that, through like such a degree of trauma that you're able to kind of create this impact not simply through movement, but really utilizing movement as a tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really, I love that idea of it's one tool in our toolbox. And um, care for health is an integrative process. It has to be. And movement seems to be one of those mechanisms that helps folks either as kind of a stepping stone into other modalities of care, or it's supportive of other modalities of care. But even on its own, it really is just this kind of powerful moment for folks to recognize, be aware of what's happening in the body, but also acknowledging that something psychological is happening as well. And it's both physiological and psychological as we move. And there can be benefits that come from it for folks that have experienced trauma.
Yeah. And like even just daily stress for people who are listening to this, like people recognize that getting out, going for a walk or getting a workout in can help reduce your stress and just make you feel a little bit better. But what is it actually about exercise and movement that does start to, ease that stress, or that does start to open you up and make you feel a little bit more free to talk?
Yeah, absolutely. I start with a little story just because I think
Yeah.
that there's this moment for me that really solidified this. So we were running a wellness group with a group of refugee women, and it was kind of this series of let's check in. We did some breathing meditation even together, had kind of an educational moment, let's share some knowledge of some kind, and then we moved together. And then after the movement, we would check in. And during an experience, I had one individual that was really like experiencing dissociation, did not want to connect with other people, even like physically kind of turning away from the group, not verbally talking. And I could tell that this individual was really just disengaged, purposefully choosing to disengage, but experiencing something. It was clear that something was going on internally. And so, we kind of just, it was happening while we were talking. And then we decided to move together. And we did this really gentle Qigong practice, which is like Tai Chi, just this really like kind of slow, methodical movement. You typically connect with breath. And as part of the exercise, I had individuals kind of choose some way to express themselves with movement that felt qigong-esque, right? So I had people, they were a sunset. One of them did like a little cat kind of like licking their arm, whatever they wanted, however they wanted to express themselves. And the individual participated. And we sat down and I thought, okay, we're going back to not engaging. That's what's about to happen. But the individual opened up and shared, and this was kind of an aha moment for me that led me into my research, was she shared that she had never felt more able to express herself than during that exercise moment that we had together. And then went into feeling comfortable sharing all of the different things that she was navigating. There were a lot of kind of life circumstances that she was navigating that were in that moment very hard. And those were kind of why she saw herself disengaging, but movement opened that up for her. And she was able to share freely. She was able to express herself and find her voice through movement. And that was so fascinating to me to think that like that was a very simple activity of creativity and movement together. And someone that was dealing with something that was so hard was able to be well in a moment because of that movement. And so then kind of diving into why that's happening, there's some really fascinating research around kind of trauma and how it isn't just psychological, it actually lives in the body. So we have a traumatic event, we experience that physically. So I'm sure all of us can think back to an event that felt stressful or traumatic in some way, and our heart responds, right? Heart rate goes up. we experience what would be considered kind of a flight or flight stress response. And then if we don't have an ability to either fly away or fight, we then potentially freeze. And so those are all physiological responses to a negative stress. And so, of course, if that is physical, what happens after is also physical for our bodies with trauma. And so understanding that movement is then a physical modality to meet a physical experience or happening in our body, that feels like it makes so much sense once we actually kind of make that connection of that trauma itself was also physical. Yes,
Mm.
of course, psychological, but physical. And then the beauty of exercise is that it has this long list of psychological benefits as well. And so we're helping to navigate the trauma that seems to be living in the body, but also maybe some of those symptoms that are both physical and psychological that are coming as
Yeah.
a result of that past traumatic event.
Is that kind of like you mentioned like the fight or flight and like I wonder if exercise almost provides the opportunity to finally release that fight or flight that's maybe been like trapped within somebody for so long. Like when people say like I worked out and I felt so much better after a stressful day. Like is just really cool how you described it as like, yeah, it's fight or flight or freeze, right?
Yeah.
And that ability to just move then almost it sounds like freeze that up from people.
Yeah, I love that idea of even just like thinking metaphorically of like breaking some kind of a chain of
Yeah.
feeling stuck in that sympathetic response. And that often is just that really is the heart of the issue with trauma is if we experience a past traumatic event and it sticks with us, right? Like there's no way to predict whether that's going to stick with us, but our perception of that event potentially leads us to maintain that fight or flight or freeze response, right? And so rather than our body naturally goes fight or flight and then comes back down to rest or digest is kind of the opposite of that, right? Where we move into a parasympathetic response, our body comes back to balance. But chronic trauma, kind of living within that trauma, is that our body doesn't find strategies to regulate back into that sympathetic response. And the kind of neurological processes that are happening, as well as the physiological processes that are happening at the muscular level, together are helping us naturally. That is a fight or flight response to do that. And then we're kind of shifting ourselves potentially naturally back into a parasympathetic response. And
Mm.
one thing to really recognize, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about this more as we go through today, the one mechanism that seems to be really important with that is our breath.
Mm.
And the fact that our diaphragm is really um, kind of almost intimately connected to our neurological system in our body. And so, because that's true, breath and exercise, like the movement of our muscles, as well as breath and the movement of the diaphragm in particular, seem to be part of that mechanism of helping our body shift back into that rest and digest kind of
Yeah.
comfortable, happy, joyful space that we want to be in.
Yeah. Diaphragmatic breathing is something that's really fascinating to me. Like,
Mhm.
can you talk more about like what that connection looks like between like the like using diaphragmatic breathing versus like there's like up and down in the chest and the shoulders kind of breathing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first, even just trying it. So for folks that are listening or kind of paying attention to our conversation today, even just trying to start by breathing in the chest, shoulders raise up to our ears. That feels it's funny when we try to do it, it feels constrictive. It's like, oh, that's
Yeah.
not comfy. But that's
Yeah.
actually how we breathe most of the time, is
Yeah.
in our chest, especially if we're living in kind of a stressful life in some way, right? You imagine yourself sitting at a computer, stressed answering emails, and you can kind of feel that in your chest. But if we engage our stomach in the breathing process and let our stomach expand as we inhale, really opening up to that breath. Of course, our chest is also engaged a little bit, but it really is focusing on not holding our tummies tight, which is a natural instinct for us as well, maybe like a vanity instinct more than anything. but it's also really letting our tummies expand, engaging that diaphragm. And what's essentially happening is our vagus nerve, which is, directly connected then to our brain, is engaged in the breathing process more actively, right? Like, sure, when we breathe normally, that's the vagus nerve is doing its job still. But when we really let our diaphragm become engaged, the vagus nerve is actually regulating, connecting to the brain, and then regulating all of the different hormones that are affecting our stress reactivity and
Mm,
our stress response. So cortisol is kind of the one that we all maybe have heard of, or it's one that is often talked about. And that regulation process is through the vagus nerve, which just so happens to be connected to the diaphragm. And so it's fascinating, like just from an anatomical position or perspective,
yeah.
it's just things are all connected to each other within the body, right? But from a psychological perspective, we're understanding that kind of that exhale, really letting ourselves exhale, that psychologically, I think all of us can potentially relate to feeling a little bit calmer, moving into that rest or digest when we do that.
Yeah. No, thanks for going through that. That's very, very cool, very interesting stuff. And when you have that kind of brain gut connection, like people, I think people do understand that there is that connection, those that gut feeling that you get, it's there for a reason because of that, right? But really cool to hear how with the diaphragm connected in there and that breathing can really activate the right response
Mhm.
more effectively, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I one thing to recognize is like stress in our life is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
Moving into flight or flight, not necessarily like that's we've had that within us as humans always, right? Like that is a natural instinct of survival. And even within our world of not having to survive an animal attacking us, that response can be really valuable. But the concern is we don't go back down
Hmm.
well, right? Like that's when the concern actually really arises. And doing something like diaphragmatic breathing, or even there's a center that I really appreciate their work. It's the Center for Mind Body Medicine, and they talk about it as just soft belly breathing. And it's this idea of just like softening your belly and letting yourself really open up to that breath. And those activities help the shift back down to parasympathetic. So we can say, great, that was lovely. I want to move back to rest and digest as soon as I can, once that kind of fear or stress or whatever it is might be gone.
Yeah. Very cool. And even just as you're talking there, I'm trying to focus on that
Right.
diaphragmatic breathing, and you notice a difference in just like how your body feels and that how you're holding tension. Like I feel like I'm holding less tension in my chest and my shoulders as I'm doing that breathing, right? So really, really cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I'm curious because I often with clients when I'm dealing with exercise and people who are very stressed out and stuff, I try and be very aware of what type of stress relief they need, right? Like I've always talked about like if you're somebody who's like very physically stressed, like you feel a lot of tension in your shoulders and stuff throughout the day, say you're a construction worker or something like that, then like exercising and doing like a weight training session in order to relieve that stress might not be the best thing for you that day.
Mhm.
Do you know like how does somebody know like what type of movement is going to be the right thing? Like, is today a day where I need to meditate, or is today a day where I need to go and like clang and bang with the weights and just like get that kind of release? How do people know what they actually need from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, this is such an interesting question because my answer, I think, is really like it completely depends.
Mm,
And sometimes my answer might be whatever you'll actually be willing to do, right? From a
yeah,
motivational standpoint, it's like, what's the thing that you're willing to actually try? Because if you're not interested in doing soft belly breathing, or you're not interested in doing strength training in the gym, you won't, right? Like I that's just such an interesting part of this conversation is like there are things that we're learning in research that seem to be really valuable mechanisms, and we'll go into that. But also do what you think you'll do, right? Like what you're willing to actually try. And so thinking about like what might be the best method of stress relief, I think also my main point of advice is just try a few things and realize that success doesn't have to be like, I feel blissful now, right? I think that that's one thing. So, for example, with meditation and mindful breathing, those sorts of things, often we think like, I'm going to feel nothing but bliss after that moment.
Yeah.
And that'd be lovely if that always happened. And I think it does sometimes happen, right? There's reasons that we are attracted to that type of activity. But sometimes we might be meditating and feel like, oh, like there's still like rumblings that I can't seem to get past. And from a mindfulness perspective, it's just like, huh, that's interesting, right? Like that's what we're trying to just have awareness on, is just like, let that be interesting, be curious rather than judgmental. And I would give the same advice for movement, right? Where it's just, it may feel never pain. I'll say that, never feel pain. That's not what we're ever wanting. If you feel joint pain, that should be stopped. But if you feel challenged physically, like, oh, this is hard, that can be really wonderful for psychological benefits as well, right? Think of like resilience and grit. It's doing something hard and seeing that you can do that, building self-efficacy and confidence in your behavior. So if weight training is the thing that helps you feel confident and resilient, then do more of that. That seems lovely. With a lot of folks that I work with, modalities that seem to be particularly beneficial are really gentle, mindful movements. So, again, movements that are intentionally bringing in the breath, which strength training can do that, right? You think of even Olympic lifting,
Yeah.
we cue breath in those types of exercises as well. But for a lot of folks that I work with, it's Tai Chi. There's a lot of research on things like Tai Chi, Qigong as beneficial movement modalities for alleviating stress, and especially kind of like for folks that have experienced trauma in their past. Walking, even just kind of gentle walking. Yoga, there's kind of a pretty robust body of research around yoga. But more research is needed to really know, like, does there seem to be a particular modality? And I think the reason that there isn't a conclusive response is because it feels different to everyone to do different modalities. And also recognizing that often, as movement professionals helping people move, as well as people that are seeking out strategies to move in their own lives, moving in a trauma-informed way can actually be really important as part of that movement. So whatever modality I'm choosing, is it trauma-informed? And so I'll just give some examples of what that might look like. Often with trauma-informed, it's important to have choice. Do I have some kind of autonomy in what I'm doing? You imagine a lot of traumas that folks experience, choice was taken away, right, during that traumatic event. And so even the lack of choice can feel traumatic. And so offering choices, even to myself, sitting, listening, and saying, okay, how am I going to move today? Letting myself choose, not because I should do something, but really letting myself kind of intellectually choose what I want to do and how I want to move. And then for folks that we're working with, same thing. How do you want to move? As you're ready, if you like, try this, right? It's very optional the entire time. So choice is really central. One thing that I will always believe in is the idea that it matters if we move with other people. I think connectedness matters so much. And just even for well-being and thriving, socialness, being with other people, matters for thriving as human beings. That's kind of central to our well-being. And in movement, I think that matters as well. Being able to feel physically safe, emotionally safe with other people. That's a really rewarding environment to move in. And so then it's like, well, whatever, however you want to move, let's walk together, let's swim together, let's do yoga together, let's dance together. Dance is so, I love dance for helping folks that have experienced trauma, because there's a lot of just kind of opening up and being creative and curious and almost goofy, right? And then we laugh, and laughter is so powerful for healing from trauma. And so all of these thoughts really are, find what you love, find what you're interested in, but consider moving with other people. Think about what is physically safe for you as well as emotionally safe for you. And then do you have a choice in the matter? Those are those are, I think, really important considerations, rather than, should I do a bicep curl versus a leg press? It's like, you choose, like, try it, see how it goes, and then decide to do that more if you want to, or decide to do it less if you want to. Um, I think it's so complex, but it's also so simple, right? It's like, just choose, just see
Yeah.
how it goes, and kind of experiment a little bit, and realize that it doesn't have to feel nothing but joy after, or even during the experience. Never pain, but you might not love it during it, and that's fine. Our body is still providing us with benefits, even if you haven't learned to love going on a walk yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the way that you said that too. Is like, what are you willing to do? Is something that I've really adjusted my approach with helping people over the years from this like real personal trainer kind of perspective of like, this is what you need to do to get the results and blah, blah, blah. And then seeing people, get results and fall off and start and not continue and those types of things, you really start to learn the importance of like, you have to enjoy,
Yeah.
you have to enjoy it. And if you can pay attention to the things that you enjoy, then I imagine it creates more consistency, especially in people who have dealt with trauma in their life. I imagine it's like finding that thing that's enjoyable for them, that you recognize opens them up. That's the thing that they're going to want to do more often.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, um, for some folks, they're like, well, I don't know what I enjoy, right? And that potentially feels a little bit scary or intimidating or whatever that might be. Um, First, recognizing really small changes produce a lot of benefits. So it can be 5 minutes of like gentle stretch, roll one shoulder back, roll the other shoulder back, right? Like that helped me. And it was 2 seconds, right? And so realizing that small moments add up, from like chronic disease management, that's also true, right? Like move for 5 minutes, add it up, it'll help. But also just from kind of a trauma perspective, thinking about noticing like, oh, something's going on, like my heart rate's increasing, I'm feeling more tension, I'm feeling kind of anxiety symptoms, whatever that might be. And do I have these simple strategies just to even like breathe and raise my hands up and down? And what does that look like to kind of move my hands with my breath pace? And you might find value in that. Or it might be something that's a little bit longer, a little bit more intensive, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Do
Can I
you?
share
Yeah,
a
no, go.
story actually?
Of course.
So we did a wellness group with a group of refugee women, and at the end we decided to have kind of a celebration party sort of thing, just to, we're at our last day, let's just move the whole time and celebrate together. And we chose to go swimming. And we were in a private space where they felt, we even like covered the windows. They felt very comfortable being in that space. It was just us. We made sure all of those things were in place. And then for some of the women, they had never been in a body of water like that before, right?
Mm.
Like they had been in a bathtub. That's the most that they had ever tried, to be in a body of water like that. And so this was one of my favorite moments of like why I think movement is helpful. So first, it was new, it was novel, and that does something really amazing to the brain too, of like, oh, I'm just going to be curious and try something, right? That's valuable. It feels like a challenge, but it's this challenge that we can like be excited about, right? They get into the water and it's like, whoa, like they're feeling buoyancy for the first time, really, and what that feels like for them. And it's just fascinating. They're almost an immediate giggle response, right? Like just like so happy because it feels new in a safe space, right? And that novelty in a safe space matters so much. But then thinking about from there how it evolved is just, it's one of my favorite memories being an exercise physiologist, because some of them were like, I don't know what to do now, right? Like I'm in the water and now what do I even do? And so
Yeah.
we're all on the shallow end, and I asked them to put their hands on my shoulders and create kind of a chain. And we just start kind of snaking around the pool together. And again, social connection, even physical touch can be rewarding if it's safe, right? And
Mhm.
thinking about ways to just kind of move together. They're learning something new. We did some actual just like, aqua tone type aerobics type exercises as well. And the whole time it just felt playful and fun. And movement can be that, right? I think a lot of times we're like, oh, I'm supposed to exercise, so I need to be on a treadmill. And for some people, that's joyful. For some people, it's not. And so finding reasons to move in playful ways, I think that's why I like dance so much, is you get to bring out some of like your personality, a little bit of goofiness. And that feels really rewarding when it comes to movement. And I'm going to choose to come back to that because I love that. Of course, I love that. By the end of the day, people were jumping off of the diving board into my arms. So I'm like catching them. And to think of like nervous to even step into the water, all the way to jumping off of the diving board with me holding a little noodle for them to float to the side with after. Even just the confidence that can be built in one session of
Yep.
movement, all of those psychological components of movement are why it makes me so excited. It's like, yes, cardiovascularly, of course that matters, but psychologically, this is a really rewarding experience as well for people, or it can be. It has the potential to be.
Yeah, really cool. That's a cool story of just like, yeah, that like first experience, because like we don't remember that as adults who have grown up being able to go like jump in a lake and swim in the pool and that type
Right.
of thing. It's just so cool, and it just reminds me of like being a kid again, of like trying those things for the first time. But then also, yeah, an example that comes to my mind is we just recently took my daughter for her birthday to a swimming pool, and there
Yeah.
was two large slides there, and some of her friends were like very nervous to go on the slides, and so but together as a group, they were like, "Hey, let's go up. If you don't want to go down, you don't have to go down." And it's like the one went down first, and then like it kind of built this confidence, and then they went down and they're like, "Wow, that wasn't so bad. That was actually really fun." It's
Right.
that really cool experience. And you mentioned something that I was going to ask you about, which is confidence. I'm
Mhm.
curious, like what is the role that confidence plays? Because as adults, oftentimes when we think about confidence, we think about like how we look. Like when I
Yeah.
work out more, I'm going to look better. I'm going to feel more confident. I'm curious how confidence plays into just even the start of just movement and new movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I have kind of two thoughts with that. So that idea of like first, folks are choosing to move for the looks of it. Like I'm going to move to feel more confident in other spaces, right? Like I'm
Yep.
going to move to change something to feel confident in other spaces. That's a lot of why we approach physical activity initially, right? Like it's almost this like socially ingrained in us, in my opinion, unfortunately, thought, right? And so recognizing that, like, sure, that might be what got someone in the door. But what I've seen with movement and what I really like about movement when it comes to that idea of like physical looks confidence is movement actually teaches us that our body is capable of something. And I actually get to feel rewarded recognizing that my body can do something rather than how I look doing something. And I think that that is a really powerful shift in our mindset to there's two sisters, they're PhDs. They actually graduated from the University of Utah. They're the Kite sisters. They have a book called More Than a Body is their text, I think. And it's this idea that your body is more than just an ornament. It's not a decoration to be
Mm,
shown. It's an instrument and capable of doing these really wonderful things. And so as you were explaining that, that's the thought that came to mind first for me is our being physically active teaches us something more rewarding than how we look. It teaches us that our body can do something and we can find joy from doing something and having it be a tool for trauma healing, having it be a tool for confidence, right? And then to kind of lean into that confidence itself is maybe one of my favorite topics, because I think that, again, if we're confident that we can do something, we'll choose to do it. If we feel confident in a space, we might feel like we have a voice in that space and we can actually like express our opinions, right? So confidence is a really important aspect of us feeling like we fit in a world, right? And specifically within physical activity, the term self-efficacy as it relates to like that specific term is really important to think about. So self-efficacy is your confidence in being able to perform a specific task. So I'm not just like self-confident as a human being. I have confidence that I can do a task. So I'm confident that I can go swimming. for whatever reason, I have resources in place. I've physically experienced it myself. I saw my friends go down the slide and they had fun, so I'm going to have fun, right? Those vicarious experiences. And so confidence is such this powerful tool in helping people make the first step to exercise, but exercise itself feeds confidence. And so it's this really wonderful kind of self-propagating concept where if we're confident to try a little, doing a little will help us be more confident to do a little bit more, and then we're more confident to do a little bit more. And then the beauty of physical activity self-efficacy, so self-efficacy specifically around being physically active, research suggests that it helps us be more self-efficacious in other domains. So we're more confident at work potentially, we're more confident in our relationships because we've learned in a space that we can be confident. And then we learn to apply that in other ways, right? When you think of a lot of the work that I do with health coaching is just like, let's try something, confirm that we can do it, and then we'll keep trying it, right? That's what habit building is often about, is confidence that I can keep maintaining that. And then again, choice. Do I want to keep maintaining that for whatever reason?
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that I've recognized also with, when I work with somebody on, let's say, a new fitness program. It's like the number one question that I'm asking people is like, what are you 100% confident that you can start with? Like
Yeah,
without a single doubt in your mind, I can commit to this. It's like, because there's no point doing anything other than that at the beginning. Because how many times have we, started and stopped and started and stopped, and it's just this failure cycle that then
right.
actually does become pretty traumatizing for the next time you're going to start, right? And so
Absolutely.
yeah, so important to just build confidence early. And I imagine that that's something that a lot of the women that are coming in with trauma, who have been tortured and these types of things, like, I imagine that there's probably quite a struggle with confidence early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think um the it's so interesting, confidence in my ability to do the task that I'm being able, like, asked to do, but also confidence that, just as you're talking, like, even confidence that I'm able to make a choice for myself,
Mm,
confidence that I'm actually able to be safe here. And all of those things really, I mean, it's perception of ourselves in spaces is so important to deciding to continue to move. So the example of like, what are you confident that you're going to do? And then even part of the conversation is, well, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, you're at a 7. Tell me why it's not a 3, right? There are reasons that you're higher than a 5. That's wonderful. But also, like, are there barriers that we should be exploring? And can the first task in engaging in physical activity be removing those barriers
yeah.
to increase your confidence so then we can actually get started? And I think sometimes we, just as humans in this world, especially because we think we should do a lot of things, we forget those steps of kind of like preparing ourselves to be able to be successful. And those pre steps are so important, just as important of a goal as actually, you know, going for a walk itself. And then the walk can confirm all of those actions that we've put in place and keep ourselves confident over time, which is really rewarding for people, especially when you think of, like, our well-being is often tied to our sense of accomplishment. And so if
Yeah.
we can find confidence and then accomplish something, both of those together, that's going to be a really rewarding pathway to thriving for an individual. And with trauma, especially when choice has been taken away, um, that confidence, it's almost like, do I have permission to be confident too, right? I think that that's, and not just folks that have experienced, you know, living in a war disaster area, right? Like that, it's not even that. It's also like, I may feel like in my own home where I should be safe, I don't feel safe. And so I don't feel confident to make my own choices. And anywhere in between, it could be in the workplace, it could be with our friend groups, it could be anywhere. And it doesn't, I think sometimes that's the issue with trauma, is we think like there's folks that I've worked with that have experienced primary or secondary torture. And of course that's traumatic. and heartbreaking and devastating and all of those things. But the reality is, for a lot of folks, feeling like you've lost choice in other spaces can feel devastating too, right? It doesn't have to be a hierarchy of trauma. It's just trauma, fact. Like trauma, it happened. You perceived it as negative, so that may be affecting you. And then also recognizing that a lot of our language around trauma is that it has to always be negative forever. But we can grow from trauma. Physical activity is one of those mechanisms to grow and heal from trauma. And then we're stronger and we're more confident than we could have been prior, right? We don't hope for traumatic events, but we can grow as individuals and become stronger. And that's a really beautiful confidence builder as well, just to kind of function from that growth mindset.
Yeah, and you mentioned something before, which was around how like building that confidence, like having confidence in a movement can then give you the confidence like psychologically and stuff. So
Right.
that it makes sense why starting with some movement and stuff like that, and then that woman who then was feeling open and more confident to actually open up and actually talk about
Mhm.
things, that's a really cool thing. And then what you just said too is like you can grow from that trauma, you can grow from that experience. Um, that's really speaks to the ability to develop resilience
Yeah.
with movement. Can you touch on that a little bit on just like how movement can actually really impact resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the concept of resilience because built into resilience, it can only exist if something hard has happened. That is the kind of the nature of resilience as I see it. You know, having grit, you have to be going through something hard to demonstrate grit, right? And so having resilience meaning I'm thriving not despite a challenging event that happened, but I'm actually that's a leverage, a spur, a sparking moment to me thriving. Um, I think that's just even knowing the definition is really rewarding because it's not, I can't be resilient in a vacuum. And recognizing, yes, all of us experience hard things. That's true of human, right? Human suffering is true, but also human joy and human resilience and human growth and human capacity for change and potential, those are all just as true. And I think that what's really fascinating is you can see that psychologically, but also physiologically, right? Like actual changes in the brain. I think that's one of the most empowering thoughts when it comes to trauma is that our brain is perceiving something a specific way. And through different mechanisms, whatever it might be, including being physically active, our brain content, the physical structure as well as the actual neurological pathways in our brain can change, and we can reinforce positive thinking pathways, not like jolly all the time, but actual like positive for our well-being pathways. And resilience is one of those things that often comes from actually rewiring the brain. And because our brain can change, trauma doesn't have to stay negative forever. And physical activity interacts with the brain really, really intimately. Like there's so many really beautiful things happening in the brain that almost counteract those pathways that have been built because of the trauma event itself. And so even just recognizing like confidence, because anatomically my brain can change, physiologically my brain can change. Maybe that's even a starting point for confidence to just say like, yeah, I know that it's possible within my human body. Let's see what I can do to experience that.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds a lot like breaking free of like a fixed mindset
Yeah.
and being more into like an open mindset of change is possible. These are real things that do happen to real people,
Mhm.
right? And
Even like failure is an opportunity for change, right? And you know, trauma isn't failure. That's not true. Trauma is something else happening to you that was not your fault, right? But recognizing that if failure can help me grow, negative things happening in my life can potentially also help me grow. And that growth mindset is just so valuable for shifting your perspective to say like, oh, this is period, to, oh, interesting, let me see how I can continue to grow from this, learn from this, whatever that might be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting what you said there about trauma as well. Like, I'm curious if can we kind of define trauma? Like,
Mm.
because we kind of talked about how trauma can be many different things. Like, how does somebody define like either this is trauma that I need to deal with, or
Right.
this is just stress and regular, life struggles and failures.
Yeah, for sure. I think first what I'll say is um, whether it's one or the other, there are mechanisms that can help both, right?
Mm,
So just starting somewhere is maybe my first piece of advice before I define trauma is that even if it's stress, Tai Chi might help. If
yeah,
it's trauma,
still needs to be dealt
Tai
with.
Chi might also help, right? Like both are very important to pay attention to, and both can be negatively impacting our lives. And both often are connected to that sympathetic response. So I'm
Mm,
experiencing fight, flight, freeze, and then fawn is another one. So kind of people pleasing. So in the event, fight, flight, freeze might happen. After the event, I might be living in kind of that chronic stress, whether it's stress or trauma, and that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are kind of my now constant potential reactions to things that are happening, right? So that being said, trauma, I'm sure I've written down this definition a million times, so I'll kind of paraphrase my thoughts on the idea of trauma is um, there's a traumatic event that happens. So it is about an event or series of events. That's often one of the things that's important to recognize. And it harms us. The important thing is that it's an event that harms us physically, psychologically, emotionally, and intellectually, whatever that might be. And then what typically we think of like a trauma event could have happened to all of us. I'm sure all of us can list at least one moment in our lives where something has happened that could have been perceived as traumatic.
mm,
But what makes trauma stay and why it sits in the body and lives in the body after is because our perception of that event consistently sustains those feelings of harm that we experience during the event. And so it's an event that causes harm, kind of at its most simple level, which, that's the most complex thing to ever say simply. But the fact that it lives on is often where we start to actually see, within the DSM-5, actually trying to treat post-traumatic stress disorder and diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's interesting, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but just because we don't fit within the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a smaller percentage of folks that have experienced trauma. The traumatic event may still be impacting our lives, and it may be more that we're perceiving it as stress or stress reactivity or just like negative affect, and our mood is really, low, or we're experiencing depressive symptoms or anxiety. Those can all come from a traumatic event occurring, whether or not it's diagnosed technically as PTSD from that traumatic event, right? And since I mentioned PTSD, just another thought that I think is really valuable that changed how I looked at trauma was there was a researcher, and I can't remember who it was, but they essentially talked about how in their conversations with folks that they work with, so they're a psychologist, and they don't actually use the word post in that term of post-traumatic stress because trauma in its nature, it is current, right? Like all of the things that are happening, my body is experiencing trauma currently because I'm in a sympathetic response again, just as if that event were happening. And for a lot of people, they actually relive the events
yeah.
and have a response from that, right? And so the idea of post is kind of, of course, there's a lot
Yeah.
of conversations that go into creating that name, but it might be kind of a misunderstanding of what's happening for a person if we just say post, because it's actually just traumatic for that person in that moment while they're just living their regular everyday lives.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really cool way to look at that. It's like it's almost an unfair title
Yeah,
to give to it, right? You're like, oh, it's trauma that happened to me. No, it's trauma that's happening to
yeah,
me.
yeah.
Very interesting.
It's in my body right now. And it's
Yeah.
not, it's not in 1990 whatever, 2000 whatever. It's current, it is present day experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate you breaking that down and kind of helping define trauma a little bit more, because I think people often feel this way where they go like, well, well, the trauma that I've experienced is nothing compared to what other people have experienced. So I should just be okay. I should be able to deal with this. It's nothing compared to that trauma.
Yeah.
But I imagine when you're seeing, some of these groups come in and you're working with some of these groups, you see different levels of it too, right? Like you see, people who are experiencing very extreme trauma or had a very extremely traumatic event, and then maybe somebody who had a little bit, less of a traumatic event, but it's still affecting them in the same way or in similar ways.
Right. Absolutely. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has been a really interesting example of this, where for some folks, they were hospitalized. That's traumatic. For other folks, maybe, on the whole other side of it, maybe never even tested positive, right?
Mm,
During the whole, 2000 on, never tested positive for COVID. But the risk of COVID-19 is potentially, or has been perceived as potentially life-threatening for even the folks that never were diagnosed, right? And so that collective trauma that we experienced, because we were socially distanced, because all of those things were happening, but also um, that risk of death, right? A risk of harm. Um, whether you're one person on one side of that or on the other side of that, you could have perceived that as traumatic, right? And so
mm,
it's not like, well, I was never hospitalized, so I should be fine, right? Like that doesn't need to be
yeah,
true. Same with any type of event that happened, right? Like it's like, oh, I saw it happen, it didn't actually happen to me. Well, actually, even secondary or vicarious trauma is real. So even as a health professional, someone tells you their story, the hearing of the story can even be traumatic. And I only heard it. I didn't even see it happen, right? And so recognizing that there's trauma is so nuanced and complex that it doesn't, if it's true for you, it's true for you, right? I think that
yeah,
that's just so important to recognize, is it doesn't need to be compared or judged. It's just like, is it happening? Yes or no? And then if yes, let's see what we can do. And if not, lovely. How did you grow from that? Let's hear that, right? It's
yeah.
it's not one or the other. It doesn't need to be one or the other.
Yeah, and really interesting what you said about healthcare practitioners who are hearing stories about these things too, because it is like we often define it as like, oh, it's just like so much, I have to give so much energy, or like there's this energy exchange,
Mhm.
which I do believe to be true, but it's interesting to hear it in that way as well. Like, we're also experiencing trauma on a daily basis as you're hearing about these traumatic events. Is that something that you've had to be very aware of and like really be in tune with yourself as you're helping these people?
Yeah, absolutely. Um it's so interesting. I've had so many experiences where I think that what can actually fatigue me a lot personally is like the anticipation of what if something comes up, and
Mm,
how do I care for that person? And so it's so interesting to think like, yes, sometimes someone has brought up something that's like, whew, that's heavy. Let me find resources. Let me connect you outside of my scope, not your therapist. Let me connect
yeah,
you with your therapist to have this conversation, right? Because a lot of times within the organizations I work with, it's like we're just moving. Like that's what we're doing together, is moving, exercising in some way, which I think in some aspects does protect me a little bit. There's less storytelling of the past, which then I'm not hearing, and I'm actually seeing like the growth moments and the joy moments. I get to do that a
yeah,
lot, which I'm grateful for. But also when hard things do come up, I think recognizing, like, advice that I would give to folks that I've learned from myself is that there's kind of, for me, maybe 3 time points of when we might be negatively impacted by it. So that like, "Oh, what if something comes up? Am I prepared? Do I know how to navigate these conversations?" Nothing's happened yet. It's my, like, pre-planning protective instincts to try and prepare myself in a moment when something happens, and then after the fact. So we finished moving together. I go home and then it's like, whoa, never mind. I think I am exhausted from that. And I didn't know in the moment that I was exhausted or going to be
Yeah.
exhausted from that. And so building in mechanisms to kind of take care of ourselves through all of those stages, I think is really important. And that's personally what I've learned for myself is just, before I don't know if this is the best word for it even, but like a ritual to kind of prepare myself, right?
Yeah.
Where it's this common habit of like, oh, I'm going to go through these mechanisms to prepare myself. So even if it's like a loving kindness meditation or like jumping jacks, like moving my body in some way to acknowledge that like I'm having an actual physiological experience right now, even in preparation for moments, right? And even if like someone's giving a speech, right? Like doing those like power poses or standing or moving your body or laughing or whatever it might be, like that's helpful, right? So it doesn't have to be that you're expecting a traumatic event, but just stress in general. And then in the moment, having mechanisms, especially things like diaphragmatic breathing, really simple, gentle movements of the hands, stretching the body, like seated yoga is really beautiful. And so mechanisms during the moment is really helpful to care for ourselves, but then we also have to have kind of these longevity after the fact strategies as well to prevent burnout and those sorts of things. And I think um, physical activity, like of course it's what I go back to. It's my natural kind of gut instinct, but it works so well to just have a regular plan of physical activity and not just like high intensity, like, oh, like work so hard, but also like those restful movements.
Yeah.
And I think that's so you asked earlier, like what movements are really valuable. I think first, recognizing that there are times when we need to actually rest completely and listening to our body when that happens, but also recognizing that movement itself can be restful and we don't have to move to improve our fitness. We don't have to only move to change our physical body in some way. We can just move to actually seek out the parasympathetic response, and building that into my regular life has been really valuable in preventing burnout and some of the challenges that come with just like, trauma seems to come up when I work with
Yeah.
folks.
Yeah. Very well said. And that really does bring everything full circle of talking about, you know, from these people who have been directly impacted by trauma and the approach that they take in order to start to find some form of release and open up and really heal that trauma to, somebody who's maybe secondary impacted or like minimally impacted, even for lack of a better term, maybe. But the
Mm-hmm.
approach sounds like it's very, very similar, almost the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah. It's like, no matter what, sure, just breathe a little, move a little, hopefully move with people, right? Like that's, if
Yeah.
I could kind of conceptualize that, it's like, that's good for all of us. And we
Yeah.
maybe don't even need to spend so much effort defining the source unless it's like, okay, maybe I need like therapeutic psychological support.
Yep.
Absolutely. That's also part of this, right? It's not that movement is replacing that.
Yeah.
It's another strategy, but recognizing that movement also might be part of the healing process, and just try it no matter, like without defining it, just try it and see if something beneficial can come.
I love it. I'm gonna finish with a quote and get your thoughts on this quote, okay? So Robert Fulghum, live a balanced life, learn some and think some, draw some and paint some, and sing and dance and play and work every day some.
So it's so funny. I'm not joking. This is on my teaching philosophy. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time. I love this quote because I think it starts with this idea of balance. And then that word some in that quote is so valuable to think about, where um, we're striving to achieve balance, whatever that looks like. And it looks different every single day of our lives, right? Balance isn't doing everything. Balance is balancing things that we enjoy and that help us. And then it just lists all of these different things. And I think it's important to recognize that it's work some. And then just as important, play some and dance some and go outdoors some and maybe try breathing intentionally some, right? Like I would add some sums to that potentially, but
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how to kind of practice self-compassion navigate finding balance. I mean, at the center of healing trauma, it's balance, right? It's regulating the sympathetic response and elevating our parasympathetic response. And that's balance at our physiological level. Homeostasis is occurring. And so to achieve balance in life, it's just some things, and movement is a part of that in a really valuable way. So I think what I would say, like the words that I love is like dance and move and play. Those are, let it be playful, let it be movement that you choose. And balance doesn't look the same to every person. It's a little bit of a mix of all of these some things in our life. And it's that balance is an art form. It's not necessarily a science, it's an art form.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for coming on the show, Kate. This is such a valuable conversation, I think, for people from just like all walks of life on how movement can just be so healing.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of like healing for anyone, right? It's for you. It's, if you're listening right now, it's for you. It's movement in your way for whatever you need it to be.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much. Again, appreciate you being here. And yeah, we'll have to maybe do it again sometime because this was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Wow, Wellness Ninjas, another powerful episode today with Kate, talking about simple but effective strategies that we can use movement and self-awareness to heal our traumas, our anxieties, our stresses, and our mental state. If this was an impactful episode for you, please take a screenshot, share on your social medias, tag us. Make sure you please go to Spotify, iTunes, anywhere that you're listening, and help leave a positive review. YouTube, like, comment, share. Please help us create more of an impact on people. If creating more healthy movement or just more healthy behaviors in your life is something that you struggle with, something that you are ready to change, then you might be interested in our 6-week mastermind program coming up on March 15th, 2023. We're going to give accountability, provide coaching, and really build the foundations of wellness that you need in your life to take the power back. If you're interested in this or any of our other services, go to www.wellnessdojo.ca. You can search us on Instagram at Wellness Dojo YYC, or search the Wellness Dojo on all other platforms. I thank you again for being here. We'll see you in the next episode.